Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and this is the belated final video in my read-along of Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda, the neo-Victorian 1980s novel that we read in the month of October, in part for Victober. Alright, so ostensibly, I was planning to talk about chapters 80 through 111, but really what I'm going to be doing is talking about the book as a whole, and talking about one of the things I think Carey is doing with the book as a whole, thematically, structurally, etc., and that I just find utterly fascinating. Okay, so as I've talked about in previous videos in this read-along, one of the things about Oscar and Lucinda that gives some people pause when they read it is that they have a difficult time believing the narrator, right, as a narrator, because he seems to be omniscient, right? He knows just scads of things that he couldn't possibly know in the history of his own family, in the history of other people's families, etc., etc. And but because there's this wealth of minutia, right, this wealth of detail in the novel. It's interesting, right, because it has a dual effect, right? So we can't possibly believe the narrator, but at the same time, because there's so much detail, it makes what he's saying more convincing. The novel is full of this kind of stitching that seems to kind of function as evidence, right? Lending an air of authority to the narrator. But I think there's actually something else going on with the narration in this book. So Oscar and Lucinda, okay, seems to me to be a work of myth-making, right? So all of this detail in the novel would seem to have, or seem to kind of create the story in this kind of documentary light, right? Like he's the narrator's going out of his way to give us all of the specifics, right, of the events, of the environments, right, the furniture in the rooms, the clothing on the backs of the people, what happened with the cutlery, right, when Oscar was given the Christmas pudding at the beginning of the book, and how it clattered to the floor. All of these little things seem to point to the novel being a kind of an exhaustive documentary account of the story of Oscar Hopkins and Lucinda Leplastrier. And on one hand, I suppose it is that. But because of something else going on with the structure of the book and with examples throughout the book, I really feel like it is less a kind of, pointillist documentary approach to telling a story than it is an act of myth-making, right, of kind of divine myth-making. So if we open up to the very first page of the book, right, the very first page, the very first chapter called The Church, the opening paragraph goes like this. If there was a bishop, my mother would have him to tea. She would sit him not where you would imagine, not at the head of the big oval table, but in the middle of the long side where, with his back to the view of the Bellinger River, he might gaze at the wall which held the sacred glass daguerreotype of my great-grandfather, the Reverend Oscar Hopkins, 1841 to 66. Okay, so from literally the very beginning of the book, Peter Carey, as the author, and the narrator as the narrator, are establishing a kind of religiosity, right? A kind of divine shimmer or glow around the figure of Oscar Hopkins. It is the focal point of the room, this sacred glass daguerreotype of Oscar. And even when the bishop is brought in, he's not put at the table in the kind of pride of place at the head of the table. He's sat at the table in such a way that he would be able to look upon this, this kind of beloved divine artifact in the history of this family. And that's the very beginning of the novel. There are also just loads and loads of names in the book that have a kind of biblical charge to them, right? Fish, cross, flood, even the name of the ship that they make the crossing on, Leviathan. But these are kind of small potatoes as far as what Carrie is doing in telling us this story as a kind of summoning of a family myth, right? A kind of conjuring of a family myth. And so one of the things that I want to talk about, the principal thing that I want to talk about here, is what Carrie does in this book with conflating beginnings and endings. Even in the structure of the novel begins with its ending. It begins in the modern day. There are just loads of examples of this, right? Conflations of beginnings and endings in the novel that have a very specific, very precise religious kind of electricity to them. On page 6 in the novel, we have this. He was one of the Plymouth Brethren, and he thought there is nothing mad in this particular bit, that the feasts of the Christian church were not Christian at all. His problem was his temper, although the word is misleading. His problem was his passion. His body was a poor vessel for containing it, and when it came to Christmas each year, it was all he could do to keep himself in check. Okay, so in that example right there, we have mention of Christmas, right? The novel, the historical aspect of the novel, right? The stretches of the novel that take place in history. It begins on Christmas Day. But we have mentioned there within the space of 1.5 lines, we have Christmas mentioned and we have the word passion, which in the Christian tradition is a word that is absolutely knitted up with Easter, right? With the end of Christ's corporeal life before his resurrection, right? And the focus on the divinity and the kind of transcendence of Christ. One might say the corporeal end of Jesus before the focus on the transcendence of Christ. So that's one example. On page 8, just 2 pages later, we have this. When Oscar ate his lunch on Christmas Day, his legs ached with excitement. He crossed his ankles and clenched his hands tight around his knife and fork. All right, so what I find interesting there, right, so we have, again, mention of Christmas Day. We have his legs aching, right? And anyone who knows anything about crucifixion, this was how people died on the cross, is that their legs eventually gave out and the weight of their body pulling down suffocated them. He crossed his ankles and clenched his hands tight around his knife and fork, right? Clenching his hands around implements designed to puncture. Okay, so that's page 8. Page 14, we have this here. It was not marine biology that led Theophilus down this path to stand chest deep in freezing water. He was a naturalist, of course, and he would collect specimens. But now he was in a passion, right? There's that word again, to bear witness. He dug his nails into the palms of his hands. He pulled himself upright by that imaginary thread he kept in the center of his skull. He would show all of Hennicombe, his son most particularly, what a true Christian thought of Christmas. His breath was shallow, and he bore on his face an expression which a stranger might mistake for a smile. So much in that passage is evocative of crucifixion, and again the mention of Christmas. On page 104, we have Lucinda starting her new life, okay, right after the death of her mother, right, the earlier death of her father, but then the death of her mother, her land being sold off, okay, and then her coming into that inheritance, right? She is literally beginning a life in this moment, in this scene. This money did not belong to them or to her either. The money was stolen from the land. The land was stolen from the blacks. She could not have it. It was 30 pieces of silver, right? So that idea, this 30 pieces of silver, calls to mind the betrayal by Judas of Jesus, right? There in that the Easter story, essentially from the Gospels. So she is beginning, she is starting out, and there's this reference to the betrayal, right, to the end, to the act that landed Jesus in the hands of the authorities. And then on page 331, skipping ahead quite far here, we have the wreck of the Grafton. Okay, the ship that brought Miriam Chadwick and her people to Boat Harbor. This was on Christmas Day in 1858. Miriam had been the only one of 30 passengers saved from drowning, right? Again, that number 30, right? 30 pieces of silver, 30 passengers. Her left arm was broken and never quite set right, but she was alive. So quite literally, we have something happening on Christmas Day, the wrecking of a ship, and everybody aboard dying, right? And that number of passengers dying being the same number as the 30 pieces of silver that we saw earlier in the novel, right? Another conflation of Christmas with Easter kind of ideas or iconography. On 345, we have a scene where Lucinda and Oscar are attending church services together on Christmas morning, and they have been there's a kind of scandal around them, right? So Oscar's living in Lucinda's house, and all of the kind of self-righteous, judgmental, religious people in their community are kind of looking down their noses at Oscar and Lucinda for this arrangement of theirs, right? But they're in church. It is on Christmas morning. It's in a chapter called Christmas Day, and it says, "And then there was the sermon. She, Lucinda, felt herself slapped and spat on, and all that landscape which she had smugly celebrated not half an hour before, she had gone on, naming trees and birds for her companion, now seemed a hateful place, dry, harsh, a tinderbox with black snakes coiled amongst its deadly grasses." Okay, this idea, she felt herself slapped and spat upon, right? Those two verbs together suggests Christ's journey to the cross. They absolutely suggest that, and that Lucinda is feeling that on Christmas Day makes this yet another example of this. And then the last one I'll bring up on page 407, and again, obviously, right, I mean, this is going to be a spoiler. This is right near the end of the book. But, yeah, but after Oscar and Percy Smith, right, notably both of them, have killed Mr. Jeffress, right, we have this here. All the drinkers were inside the tavern. Mr. Smith noted this before he did a thing. Then he took the blanket from the seat and wrapped it around the quaking Hopkins. He brought him forcefully to the ground, and there, without thinking why or what he was doing, he swaddled him as though he were a little child. He stilled the thrashing limbs by force. He held him bodily across his knees and patted him. Okay, so within the space of literally, what are we talking about here? 10, 12 lines, including the paragraph just prior to that one. We have the violent death of someone, and then we have someone being swaddled in a blanket, right, as though he were a little child, right? Language that suggests the manger, Christmas language. Now, some of you hearing this might be thinking, wow, man, Jason's reading an awful lot into these things, right? He's seeing maybe things that aren't there, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to call your attention to something on page 26, in the chapter Throwing Lots. And this is where Oscar decides, or where the universe or God decides for him, where he will spend his religious life, right? What his calling will be. And he's essentially making a kind of something on a drawing on the ground with chalk, right, on the rock ground. That looks to other people in the region, in the neighborhood, as it were, to be a kind of hopscotch or child's game. But really, what it is, it's he's throwing lots, right? So there are all these boxes that he draws on the ground, and he puts symbols in each box. He draws symbols in each box, and it's all coded, Okay, right. This one represents the Plymouth Brethren. This one represents the Anglicans. Right, like there are all of these different meanings to all of these symbols in the boxes. When Oscar had made these 4 squares, he added a tail of 2 more squares to make his system look like a child's game. Right, he doesn't want people cottoning on to what he's doing. There'd be some kind of whiff of, not the paranormal, but the occult about it. He put a 0 in the first square because it was nothing, and an omega at the next because it was the end. And then seeing he had the alpha and omega of Revelation 1:8, a quotation made by accident, he knew it was not an accident at all. And that what others might call chance or coincidence, he knew to be the word and blessing of God. Right? And then seeing he had the alpha and omega, right, the beginning and the end, a quotation made by accident, he knew it was not an accident at all. Carey is a brilliant writer, and he's not just brilliant on the level of kind of sentence making, right, and a kind of a poetic awareness, right, of the music and the rhythms of language and words that look and sound beautiful together. He is not merely brilliant on that level. He is trying to demonstrate for us how over the course of generations a kind of religion can be made, right? And so the narrator's not making a religion around his distant ancestor, Oscar Hopkins, but the book seems to me to be a kind of commentary on how Christianity, right, as a collection of stories, as a narrative, began to take root over generations in people, and the very thing is happening here in this book, right again, right in the contemporary setting at the very beginning of the novel. The glass daguerreotype of Oscar Hopkins on the wall is sacred to the family. It's a sacred object, and so I find it fascinating that the narrator is telling us the story of this ancestor of his in such a way that he's somehow imbuing, a kind of divine light into the memory of his ancestor. And one of the ways that he's doing it is he's giving us the whole scope, the whole compass of Oscar's life, right? I mean, from his childhood on to his death, okay? But also the effect that he's had on people, right? I mean, I got my notes here. So the fate of Lucinda, right? The effect that Oscar's presence in her life has on her, right? She's left ruined. The moving of the glassworks from Sydney Harbor to Bellingen, right, across all that land. The role of the little weatherboard church after it has been recovered from having sunk and had weatherboards attached to it, to the sides of it. The hope given to Kumbangiri Billy's aunt by Oscar, right? If you'll remember, she was the young woman who was being just repeatedly raped in that little tavern out in the middle of nowhere by Jeffress's men and the other men who were there getting drunk. Oscar has this, like, we don't see it as it's happening, like it's related after the fact, but Oscar has an exchange with her, and in that exchange he helps restore her dignity. He gives her hope. He gives her something to focus on, something to look forward to. So we're seeing in this novel all of the kind of far-reaching effects that his life has or has had on people over the years, and many of those effects, right? I mean, apart, I suppose, from what happened with Lucinda. But even though Lucinda was ruined, she herself, after her death, had a kind of new life, right, as a kind of trailblazing feminist figure for scholars and students of 19th and early 20th century industry in Australia. So she's even kind of reborn in a way. And I just love how all of this stuff in the book, right, the conflations of the beginnings and the ends, all of this kind of religious imagery and these religious ideas kind of imbuing Oscar's life beyond him just being an Anglican priest. how it all serves to kind of undergird or buttress up this conception of Oscar as as a kind of divine or religious figure in the past whose life and whose legacy is still bearing on the present somehow. And I just think it's kind of miraculous and beautiful and strange and difficult to pin down. And yeah, so anyway, those are my final thoughts on Oscar and Lucinda. I apologize if it was a little bit scattered, if I was maybe not quite as articulate or as coherent as I wanted to be, but I'm out of practice, so bear with me. I hope you guys are having a good weekend. More than that, I hope you guys are having a really good, or as good as possible, right, given everything going on in the world, a really good Christmas season, right? I mean, we've just come through Thanksgiving here recently, and Christmas is right around the corner. So, yeah. I hope, like I said, things are going as well and as beautifully and as comfortingly for all of you as is possible right now. So, that's it. Let me know what you think down below, and I will talk to you guys again very soon. Hopefully, very soon. Adios.